Hey, I'm Joshua and I'm making this game about dwarves escaping a procedurally generated cave by using grappling guns. Just a year ago, the game was basically just a rectangle dangling around in a cave trying to escape. But now it's starting to look like an actual game and I never thought this many people would want to play it. Since the beginning, the game always lacked enemies, the only ones being the bat, the crystal crab and the snatcher. But to make it even worse, I had to remove the bat, so the game only has 2 enemies. But not only are 2 enemies not enough, they are also not that fun. It was like playing Minecraft with the only enemies being silverfish and sweet berries. Long story short, the game desperately needed a more fun enemy. And when I say desperately, I mean desperately. I have to submit a polished demo of my game in a few months. But what makes this so scary is the fact that if people hate my demo, the game's launch is going to be even worse. So if I don't want 2 years of game development to be for nothing, I need a good demo. I started collecting some ideas for a new enemy, but it had to meet the following criteria. The new enemy had to add more life to the game. It should not be easily avoidable like the current enemies, and there should be a unique and creative way to kill it, not just by gunning it down. And that's when I remembered that I could just ask my Discord server to come up with some ideas, but that turned out to be just see for yourself. Yeah, I think I'd be getting death threats if I added these to the demo. There were some good ideas too, but the artists also had a few ideas. Some of them being a golem that rolls boulders at you and creates a small earthquake that stuns the player. A spider sitting in a web which shoots webs at the player and slowly drags him into the web to eat him. And lastly, a skeleton that throws dynamite. I decided to make the dynamite throwing skeleton because it met all the criteria we were looking for. Not to mention that the golem would be perfect as a guard for a temple, which we wanted to add later, and the spider might still be easily avoidable. But you might wonder, how is the skeleton supposed to add life to the game? Well, if you take a look at the current enemies in their default state, you'll notice that you won't notice anything. Cause if you don't do anything, they won't do anything. That's what I wanted to do differently for the skeleton. Instead of standing on the spot, the skeleton could patrol around like he has his own life. This would also make it more difficult for the player to avoid the skeleton. But there's another thing I wanted to try, which is usually only used in 3D games like Minecraft. This could either end up being an absolute game changer or make everything look like these weird animations from the bowling alley. The thing I wanted to try is a patented advanced technology to make animations. Usually animations are made frame by frame, meaning you make a bunch of images of the enemy and play them accordingly. But this time I wanted to try something very different. I wanted to take all the individual parts of the skeleton, put them together in the game engine and only animate the position and rotation. This approach would allow me to make very complex animations and easily edit them however I wanted. If this animation style works, we would be able to make much bigger enemies and bosses in the future and save tons of hours of animating. Now for the fun part, making the skeleton. But there are 3 challenges that I don't know how to overcome yet. The first one being giving the skeleton some brains, so it can detect obstacles and move in this very complex randomly generated environment. Another thing I'm worried about is how I am going to make it throw the dynamite perfectly at the player every time, because there are some situations where a simple throwing function just won't cut it. And the last thing is, how the heck am I going to make this enemy add life to the game? But I guess I'll have to figure these things out on the way. I created an object with each individual body part attached to it as a separate object. You'll see why I did this in a second. And now I can try what I've always wanted to try. Rig-based, or should I say bone-based animations. I made the idle animation and it actually looks much better than I expected. But this is not how it will look in the game, because my game uses pixel perfect, which makes everything look like pixel art. Remember how I said I don't know how to make this add life to the game? Well, what I want to add next could change this. For this, I simply made the skeleton go in a random direction and when it hits a wall, it waits a few seconds and turns around. The skeleton basically just patrols around when it doesn't see the player. But in my opinion, this simple trick makes it seem like the skeleton has its own little life inside of this simulation. Now for the more important part, chasing the player. For this, the skeleton has to find the player and then run after him while avoiding walls and cliffs. This was the first challenge I didn't know how to solve, because I wanted this to look natural and even considered using some sort of machine learning. But this was definitely outside of my abilities, not to mention that I would have to do all of this before the release of the demo. But as luck would have it, I started the Minecraft server with some friends on the same day and came across this guy. And he actually gave me a lot of inspiration. His movement looked completely natural and he is entirely coded, so no machine learning was used. This inspired me to do it the simple way with my skeleton. But first I had to make the skeleton detect walls, steps and cliffs. and make him not stupid. He should jump over steps and stop at walls and cliffs. This was pretty simple to do because it's basically just raycast checking for obstacles. But what I didn't expect was that the more complicated part was going to be the jumping itself. When the skeleton touches a step, it should jump over it. The problem is, when I applied a force over the step, the skeleton only jumped up and not over the step. I first thought something was wrong with how I calculated the jump force. But I quickly realized it was actually because of the tile colliders. So obviously the skeleton has to avoid the collider somehow, so I added another raycast that checks for steps and makes the skeleton jump before it actually touches the collider. This way the diagonal force won't just shove it into the wall. Okay, jumping seems to be working now. Looks kinda weird though, so before I make it throw dynamite, I'll quickly add a climbing animation. This looks wrong. Very wrong. Oh yeah, that looks much better. A few days ago I didn't know how to make a smart enemy, and I still wouldn't consider him the smartest, but I guess he's good enough for his job. So I think I have successfully overcome this challenge. The next challenge is to make the skeleton really good at throwing dynamite at the player. It's very important for this guy to throw accurately, because it wouldn't be very fun if you always missed. And on top of that, he would destroy everything with his dynamite spamming. Luckily, dynamite was one of the first items I added to the game, so I can get directly to the throwing mechanics. My first lazy idea was to just make the skeleton throw the bomb directly at the player in a very flat trajectory and detonate the bomb as soon as it's close to the player. This would be really easy to make, but you might have already thought of some downsides of this. The biggest one being that this would be completely overpowered. So I knew I had to find another way to do this without breaking the game. And that's when I realized this might be the first time I would actually use something from math class in real life. If you draw a line of the path of the flying object, you'll get this, a parabola. I had to learn a lot about these in school, so I thought this might be useful to calculate the right throw direction and force. But when I tried to use this for throwing, I realized that this is going to be much more complicated than I thought, because there were a couple problems. First of all, the player and the skeleton can be on different heights, which already makes calculating the right trajectory much more difficult. And second of all, there wasn't really a way to account for cave walls being in the way. So considering the limited time compared to the size of my to-do list, I tried a much easier version. The skeleton just calculates the direction to the player, multiplied by throwing force and player distance, and then simply applies an upwards offset. I experimented with all these complex throwing calculations for days, and this almost seems too simple to work. But when I started the game, it worked, and it worked again and again and again. So, did I complete the second challenge? I have to admit, I really wish I could have made it work with the fancy parabola calculations, but it seems to work fine, so it's half complete. It's time for the last and probably the most important challenge. The skeleton has to add life to the game. Somehow. I think patrolling already added some life, but it still didn't feel right. I wanted to feel like you're fighting an enemy that actually wants to kill you, and not something that mindlessly throws bombs at things. But the most obvious thing to do right now is to give the skeleton a health value and a death animation, because if something should feel alive, it should be able to die. Anyways, I made a dying animation that spawns each individual part of the skeleton and has some particles flying around. And of course I made the skeleton take damage when shot. This was the first time I could actually play against the skeleton, and it was amazing. Compared to the old enemies, this one is so much more dynamic and fun to fight. But there was still one thing missing. Remember when I was looking for an idea for an enemy, it had to have a unique and creative way to be killed. And I had the perfect idea for it. If you time it right, you can shoot the dynamite mid-air and detonate it close to the skeleton. This made the fights against the skeleton much more enjoyable, but it still has a problem. When you get close to the skeleton, it just stays on the spot. Considering his whole job is to attack from a distance, it would make sense for him to try to avoid being too close to the player. And if we take a look at a skeleton in Minecraft, it actually does a similar thing. So I tweaked the code a bit to make him walk backwards when the player gets too close. And when I pressed play, I was very pleasantly surprised by how much of a difference this little change made. It kinda feels like he cares about his own life now, which also adds some life to the game. But I still wasn't very happy with it. Something just felt unfinished. And to be honest, I was devastated, because I always thought that the lack of fun enemies was what made the game feel so unfinished. And I put all my hope of this game being fun into the skeleton, but now I had a fun enemy and the game still didn't feel right. I started doubting if the game was actually fun. But if I submit my game's demo in its current state, people would probably hate it. So I had to fix this as soon as possible. I was completely demotivated, I didn't know why the game felt unfinished, I had no idea how to fix it, and a lot of people expected a demo soon. But that was actually the best thing that could happen to me. You heard that right. Me being demotivated was a good thing. Here's why. To test the skeleton, I used to put him into the game manually. The other two enemies actually get spawned when the world is generated. Now, why was me being demotivated a good thing? Well, it was kinda annoying to manually place these into the scene, so I just decided to quickly make an enemy spawn system to make testing easier. But never would I have thought that this exact spawn system would actually be the solution. When I first hit play, it was nothing more than a simple test to see if the enemy spawn system was even working. But as wave after wave of enemies appeared, something shifted. I found myself instinctively on high alert, expecting some sort of surprise attack at every moment. The system didn't just work. It actually made the game feel tense in the right way. I couldn't believe this was what I was looking for the whole time. An enemy spawn system. It finally felt like the game moved a lot closer to being ready to release. And this was probably one of the most obvious things I've ever missed. Sometimes that's just what happens when you've spent thousands of years on the same game. You just go blind to stuff like that. But what you don't want to be blind to is the release of Cavescape at the end of this year. So click the top link in the description and wishlist it now to get notified when it releases or goes on sale.